So I think that's so important to pass on to the people that we are educating at the farm, and the families that we're serving. It just provides a little bit more perspective that a tomato isn't a tomato. A tomato at the grocery store may have been picked, a month ago, 2 months ago, sprayed with things, grown with chemicals that keep it alive longer. It has no taste. And it's just different than the quality of food that we're producing at the farm, and that a lot of local farms are dedicated to producing.
Hello, and welcome to the Dragon Tree Podcast, the show where we talk to great communicators about how they do what they do. I'm your host, Chris Hobson, and today we're speaking with Samantha Kuhn. Samantha is Executive Director of JK Community Farm, which is a nonprofit farm designed to alleviate hunger and provide food education for the food insecure in Northern Virginia. Thank you so much for joining me today, Samantha.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Well, JK Farm is laser focused on helping the food insecure of Northern Virginia. Do you all have like a working definition of what constitutes food insecurity? Because I know sometimes there's definitions out there. And how do people usually compensate for a lack of nutritionally dense foods?
Sure. So we use the definition used by the USDA or put out by the USDA that food insecurity is a lack of consistent access to food that allows you to thrive or have a active, healthy lifestyle. So really just not about having food to eat, but having the right food to eat or healthy food to eat.
Yeah. And the access to that food is so important. And that's where you all really come in. So how do people, in your experience, how do people compensate for that, for having a lack of a really kind of like a diverse diet?
So unfortunately, because healthy food is the most expensive food, people compensate by purchasing highly processed foods that then can lead to overall poor health outcomes, diabetes, obesity, other chronic diseases caused by inflammation in your body, because when foods are so processed, they can be really damaging to your body. And unfortunately, healthy food is kind of the last, people, when they're hungry, at least you're eating, something. And so even when that's heavily processed and people have other bills they need to pay, so, you can't, if you're choosing between having a healthy meal or healthy meals for a week or electricity in your house, water in your house, you need to provide for your family. And if that means processed foods, then that's kind of what it comes out to be. So we are really dedicated to making sure that people know that healthy food is a basic human right. We want everyone to have access to healthy food. So we make sure that our food pantry partners have all the healthy food and really better quality food than we would be buying at the grocery store.
Yeah, and you mentioned your partners, the food pantries you partner with in the area, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk about your approach, because I think your approach to farming is different from most farms, at least in my experience, where you actually donate 100% of what you grow to the food insecure population through those distribution networks, like you talked about the food pantries. So I read that your team donated actually around about 250,000 pounds of food last year. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background on sort of how the farm got started and, how it came to be that you focused on a sustainable farming approach.
Sure. So we started in 2018. I graduated from University of Tennessee in 2016. And while I was in school, I had a professor that I just kind of clicked with, and she was environmental sociology. And so she encouraged us, and I kept taking like every class she offered because I loved her. And so
Right.
in one of her classes, she encouraged us to don't come to the classroom, go out and do something that matters. Like, don't spend your time here. You're going to learn more in the real world and you can make the difference.
Interesting.
And which my parents were like, so we're paying for classes.
You're paying for what now?
Yeah.
Right.
But I loved it. And I connected with a community farm in Knoxville, and they were doing rehabilitation of prisoners. and a lot of their food was going back into the prison system. They were selling food. They had a lot of different pieces to their farm, but I just kind of fell in love with it. And when I graduated, and I moved back to Virginia, and I just kept talking to my parents about it. And I was like, this farm was so cool. Like, there's so much food insecurity. Like, what if, we had a farm that could donate the food to the food pantries here? And um, just going back to the farm, I was like, oh, and we could, help the prison system and blah, blah. And they, wanted me to reel it in a little bit.
I was
And
gonna say that's a tall order, right?
yeah,
Right out of college.
exactly. And I was pre-med all through school, and I had always been interested in being a doctor. I wanted to be a pediatrician since I was like 6. And
Oh wow.
so for parents to hear that actually you want to start a nonprofit instead and ditch all of that,
Mm,
then they didn't get it,
right.
which is fair. But eventually they got on board. Now they're huge supporters of the farm. They donated the land to start the farm, and
Oh my gosh.
it's been great since then. And we have a amazing team at the farm, and since 2018, we've donated a little over 1.2 million pounds of food.
And have you kept in touch with that professor? I'm always interested if when people make that connection. Did you keep that relationship going, or have they been to
After
the farm, or?
after the second year of the farm, when I was like, okay, this is working, I sent her an email, and I was like, this is what we did. I sent her an article that was written about the farm, and I was like, this is what like you helped us do, and we're so
Wow.
grateful. Um, and she loved to hear it. She'd never been out to the farm. I haven't talked to her since, but
Oh wow. How gratifying as a teacher, though, that you had that much of
she
an
was
impact.
amazing.
That's so cool.
I would
Wow.
imagine she has had that impact on a lot of people.
Wow. So it sounds like you actually grew up to some degree farming. Like you grew up around it. Is that right?
No, not really. I grew up in Fairfax, and we were in Clifton, which is kind of like a pocket of farmland within Fairfax.
Oh, okay.
But
Sure.
we never did anything ag. We were like a
Interesting.
dirt biking family, but not a not a
Oh,
farm
okay.
family.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a natural progression there now. Well, and for people watching who may not be from the area, that's Fairfax, Virginia. And I think you already mentioned that you left for University of Tennessee and came back to Virginia. But
Yeah.
just to clarify that, well, and something that you all, and I don't know if this was in the mix from the beginning or if it's something you came to eventually, but your team practices something called chemical free 4-season agriculture. Say that 5 times fast. Can you please describe what that is?
Sure. So our primary focus is regenerative agriculture, which means that anything that we're taking out of the soil through a season, by growing the food, we're putting back into it with soil implements. And so that allows us to be kind of beyond organic. We're not certified because we don't sell anything, so paying for the certification doesn't really work out for us. But we don't use any synthetic fertilizers at the farm. Everything is organic that we use, and that makes it higher quality food for the families at the food pantry. I never wanted to cause anybody additional problems. The families that we're serving have enough struggles with health. Obviously, they're facing food insecurity. I don't want to pump them full of chemical fertilizers that could cause additional problems. So we're really
That's
dedicated
thoughtful.
to making sure that the food is clean as possible, healthy as possible, and then volunteers run our farm. I don't want volunteers interacting with any chemicals. No, nobody should be, in my opinion. So,
That makes sense. And
um,
and we'll talk about the volunteer aspect of this in a minute because that's really fascinating. But first, so we've talked a fair amount up to this point about vegetables, but you also produce animal protein on the farm too, including cattle and venison. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that side of the operation and kind of how all that meat is prepared for donation and things along that line.
sure. So we have a sustainable herd at the farm, which means that we have a calf cow program. We breed our own cattle. Um, it's all grass fed beef, and they're Black Angus. We have about 60 of our own cows. And then we receive donations from local hobby farmers. Western Loudoun is an area with a lot of farmland, but a little bit different than, I guess, traditional farm areas because people have livestock because it's pretty and they like it, and not necessarily because their lives depend on selling that livestock. Um, so that's fortunate for us and the families we serve because we get a lot of cattle donated to us. We send it to two processors that we really love in the area, and they um, are very particular about animal welfare, and that was important to us. And so they get everything prepared for our food pantries. The pantries pick up directly from our processors. And for our venison, we partner with Hunters for the Hungry, which is an incredible organization. They process everything, they cover the cost of all of the processing through Hunters for the Hungry for venison. And then that way we're able to designate which food pantry is picking it up. In where for our beef, we're covering the cost of all of the processing, which is pricey for our budget, but also it's meat is the most expensive part of a meal that a family would be buying. And
Right.
this is allowing them to have everything they need for a meal. We're donating the produce, we're donating the meat, we're donating herbs, and that allows them to have a full meal, healthy meal from what we're donating. They're not, trying to supplement with anything else. We're not anticipating for families to just eat, our produce for their whole meal. So we needed to supplement. And then we donate eggs as well from our chickens.
Oh. Oh, eggs. Okay, yeah, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. Yeah, I like how you all really keep the end user in mind. It sounds like through the whole process, it's not just about excuse me, it's not just about, creating inventory or something. It's like you're actually you've really thought through about, how people are gonna kinda end use the end product, if I can put it that way.
Oh yeah,
That's
that's
really
right. That's why
interesting.
we're
Yeah,
here. We're just here to help them.
very
It has
sustainable.
nothing to do with us. Yeah.
So interesting. Well, something else that leapt out, when I was doing my research is that the entire farm is run really by a full-time staff of 3 people, including yourself. And this means that by and large, it's really run by volunteers and events that you run, like, corporate team building exercises and things like that. So could you please talk about how all that works? And I guess, from like a business model perspective, it's really fascinating to me. So if you could talk about maybe the business side of it as well.
Sure. So for the longest time, I guess until last 2 years ago, we were a team of two.
Oh,
And when my daughter joined the team, we needed another real team member. And it's been great. So it's myself, Mike, who's our farm manager, and Charlotte recently joined us, and she has been serving as our education director. Um, but really, when you're a team of three, it's everybody wears all the hats, and our team is incredible. But we end up not doing much of the planting or the harvesting because our volunteer support is so incredible. Last year, I think we hosted 6,800 volunteers.
wow.
And that's individual volunteers, non recurring. If they come out when we're tracking it, we're only counting it once. Most people come out multiple times in the season. And our corporate volunteers, we hosted 77 corporate volunteer events. And that's incredible because a company will send out 100, 200 volunteers. They'll work with us for 3 hours. They'll donate to come out, which really helps with our budget and providing all of this food for the food pantries. They have an incredible day. It's beautiful at the farm. They work hard. Um, they have so much fun spending time together. And so many companies are remote now that a lot of people are meeting each
Right.
other for the first time in this fun environment. And they know that they're giving back. They're working really hard. So it's incredible. I love seeing it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It's so neat how, because I noticed, at least in this area, I would say really within the last 5, maybe 7, 8 years, that a lot of organizations build in volunteer time as well. So you're talking about corporate team building, and that's one thing, but there's a lot of companies that like really encourage just like even individuals to volunteer. So I imagine you probably see a fair amount of that as well.
Yeah, and it's great. It works out for us because we can host large groups where a lot of organizations can host, maybe 10 people, but we'll gladly take 200. really
Yeah,
the
right.
bigger the group, the better, and
You're not
we
going to push back.
have endless work. Yeah, so we'll take them
Wow.
all.
Gosh, you're like an event coordinator plus a farm, running a whole farm. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was just
Um,
talking to one of our corporate groups this week, and they were like, "Are you guys sure? Like, you can handle this group?" And I was like, "Oh, we have 200 people every weekend. We're good. Don't worry
right.
about it."
200 of your closest friends, right?
Exactly.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, your team bases, so it's what I also found so interesting is that you are very sensitive to, again, there's that end user always in mind, or end, consumer, or however you want to put it, that you actually, you base what you produce somewhat, at least, on the needs of the community. So I saw where you offer an annual survey to the families, and please walk me through how that works, because I'm not. Maybe you have families that are that you've been working with for a while. Maybe there's new families, but you have to, you do a good job of ensuring that they have that access to healthy foods that they really need. So can you please talk about how that whole process works of even just assessing the need?
Sure. So it's kind of interesting because we are kind of the middleman. We don't directly distribute to any families. We partner with our our local food pantries, one large food pantry in each county, so Loudoun, Fairfax, Arlington, and DC. And they then distribute to the families and they distribute to the smaller food pantries. So once the food leaves the farm, we don't know like who's receiving it, what their needs are, what their families look like. And in year one, we were growing what we like to eat because
Right.
that's what we
Exactly.
know. And we are white Americans that love broccoli. And that, um, it wasn't, meeting all of the needs, all of the cultural needs of the families that we serve. And so we started using this survey, and it's distributed by our food pantry partners somewhere between Thanksgiving and New Year, which allows us to order our seeds. And that's when they're serving the most amount of people. And so this gives us an idea of what foods they prefer, any issues that they're having with our produce, like if they don't know how to prepare certain things. We always like to make sure that when it's getting distributed, the quality of the food is just as good as we see it leaving the farm, to see if we can help with any refrigeration confusion or anything like that. Um, and it gives us an idea of what chronic diseases people are facing, if there are certain foods that we can grow to help with that, certain herbs, suggestions and recipes that we can make. And it gave us a new perspective on what like foods other cultures like.
Oh,
Peppers
wow.
across the board are highly requested.
Oh,
So we have, I think, 12 varieties of peppers that we grow because it's just been such a high request. People don't like Swiss chard as much as we thought that they would because it's
right.
nutrient dense. So it's just kind of changed how much we grow of each thing, and what our focuses are to make sure that people have not only healthy food, but healthy food they want to eat. We're not trying to force them to eat food that they don't like.
Yeah, it sounds like you're, as much as you all educate, and we'll talk about the education component of this in a minute, but it sounds like you all are being educated too, and you're open to being educated about how other cultures kind of eat, the patterns, and you're really kind of sensitive to tailoring everything to that. That's really interesting. And
Yeah.
I wonder, does that come from your background as I read that you're a functional nutritional therapy practitioner, and kind of what is that, and how does that expertise help support your work there at the farm?
Sure. So I've always been very interested in nutrition, and of course, with the farm, it's so important. Um, and I've always been really, and I don't know if I don't want to say this and hurt your podcast. I've been really disappointed in the American food system.
Oh, okay.
The standard American diet is called SAD, which is
Oh.
very fitting. um,
Is that an
and
acronym? Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt. Is that an acronym, SAD?
yeah, and
What
for standard
okay. What
American
is it? Standard American diet. I'm
diet.
sorry, I didn't
Yeah,
catch it. Got it. Thank you.
which puts a lot of emphasis on like more processed foods, a ton of oils, a ton of grains, and it's just the focus needs to be on whole, unprocessed foods. And that's why I chose the program that I did, because that is what really matters and will provide the right nutrition, and nutritionally dense foods like the food that we're growing at the farm. So not only fruits and vegetables, but fruits and vegetables that are grown locally and the right way. Um, and so I think that's so important to pass on to the people that we are educating at the farm, and the families that we're serving. It just provides a little bit more perspective that a tomato isn't a tomato. A tomato at the grocery store may have been picked, a month ago, 2 months ago, sprayed with things, grown with chemicals that keep it alive longer. It has no taste. And it's
Right.
just different than the quality of food that we're producing at the farm, and that a lot of local farms are dedicated to producing.
Yeah, and I think you can really taste the difference when it's like a one-to-one. If you have like if you had them right in front of you and you tasted one versus the processed one versus the not so processed one. But I just think a lot of people that may not even just be in their contextual understanding,
Right.
and I've totally lumped myself in with that group. Sometimes I wouldn't know the difference unless I had them right in front of me. So that's really interesting. And I want to come back to that in a minute about the education that you all do, which is so important. First, I was wondering, we've talked about it a little bit about the partners the groups that you partner with, like for instance, Loud and Hunger Relief, Arlington Food Assistance Center, and others in Northern Virginia. So, can you talk about how those partnerships? Sounds like that was a process where they kind of grew over time, and how do you and this speaks to the kind of the core theme of this podcast, which is talking to great communicators. So how do you and your staff of three, including yourself, coordinate and communicate with all these groups to kind of make sure everything's working and all the trains are running on time, so to speak?
Sure. So each food pantry partner that we have has a day of the week that they pick up on site. For example, if Loud and Hunger Relief picks up on Mondays, Food for Others will pick up on Wednesdays. Arlington picks up on Saturdays, and DC, because they're coming such a long way, we give them some flexibility and they can choose what
Right.
to pick up. Um, but Loud and Hunger Relief was our first partner, and we would not be here if it wasn't for them. They are incredible. Everyone within their organization is kind and caring, and they have made it possible for us to grow. And they've just supported us along the way, whether that was looking for grants or looking for volunteers, just anything to kind of make this get off the ground and work. Um, they were there to help and answer any questions, and they still are. And so they also developed the concept of a produce hub, which allows them to pick up food from us at the farm. And maybe they don't have enough refrigeration space to store it, or they are worried about food waste, or they want to make sure that families in the county that aren't accessing food through them still have access to this healthy food. So they send out a mass email to all of the smaller food pantries in the county, and I think a few outside of the county too, but they can pick up
Right.
from Loud and Hunger Relief any of the produce that they pick up from us,
Oh,
and
interesting.
take it
Okay.
back to their pantries. So that allows us to serve so many more people, and takes a lot of pressure off us because we're such a small team. It would be hard if all of the pantries that are accessing our food were picking up at the farm, and they just kind of make it easy. And all of our pantries are that way. We never wanted to get involved in the distribution process. Our food pantries locally are incredible, and we don't we don't need to add, take away from what they're doing. We don't need to be a part of the distribution. They've got that handled. They just need access to the right foods.
Oh, so just like almost like a hub and spoke kind of network. And yeah, it seems like with for any small business owners out there who might be watching, yeah, it seems like delegating authority is really the way to go when you have kind of a small lean operation like yours. It's really great that you have those trusted partners you can rely on. So I got just kind of sticking with that for a minute. Do you have to I just imagine, just based on the composition, the demographic composition of kind of the different places, like you just mentioned, people are coming from Loudoun County, they're coming from DC, they're coming from Arlington. So do you have to calibrate I guess, what you donate in terms of produce or meat to the different pantries specifically? Because like some are more in an urban environment, some are semi-rural, some are suburban. How does that work, or is it constantly shifting?
So that comes back to the survey for sure, seeing what families want. Um, and there's some limitations, like one of our partners, because of their space, and I don't know if they have access to it through their county or they're renting it, but they can't take root crops because they're dirty. Um,
Oh,
and
okay.
so that's kind of a challenge. But otherwise, all of the food pantries want their families to have access to the healthiest food possible. So as long as it's something that is not being wasted, as long as people are selecting it, they'll pick up anything. Um, and food pantries are not picky. They're happy
Right.
to have food. They're happy to have produce, because otherwise they just don't have it. So they can't say, "Hey, we don't want tomatoes," because then they just have, processed foods, and they're trying as hard as we are trying to push processed foods out of the pantries, they're trying to get rid of it too. It's just they can't push it, they can't get rid of all the processed foods until they have enough healthy food to
Mm.
provide for the families they're serving.
Well, so like we talked about, we kind of foreshadowed a little bit the food education portion of this. Such a big part of your work, and I imagine there's a fair bit of it that goes on with the distributors, but also primarily with the end user or the people who are picking who are going to consume the food. So why do you feel that educating, especially I read that you really have a focus on young students about why do you feel that educating people, students, about proper nutrition and agriculture is important? And actually, how do you go about educating these student groups? Sounds like you've got so much else going on. How do you carve out time for the education piece?
Sure. So we have field trip days that students from all over Northern Virginia come out, a lot of public schools, a lot of private schools, a lot of homeschool co ops. And I love starting with younger students because if they get it in their head early, where real food comes from and the difference in the packaged foods, and the food that's actually grown, they just have a better connection, with food, and then also educating them about food insecurity at a young age in a way that they can understand, and not in a scary or sad way or anything like that. But I think that it just puts an idea in their head about one, how they can help other people, um, and then two, how food is a commodity, I guess, so that they're not wasting foods. Kids take a bite of something and they throw it away, but if we can put a little idea in their head that food waste exists, or that they could compost the food and put it back into the earth as long as it's real food, I think it just adds a little bit extra thought, to what food is for younger students. And if kids are harvesting it at the farm, we see it all the time. They'll eat it. So
Oh,
if a parent
okay.
puts something on your plate at home, the kid's like, "Oh, disgusting," not eating that. If they harvested at the farm, we had a field trip this summer. The kids ate like 4 whole things of kohlrabi. What kid is going to eat
Oh, wow.
kohlrabi that's just put like by their parents'
Right.
plate? None of them. But they wanted seconds, thirds, and we see it all the time. Even my daughter, when she's out harvesting, she's 2, and she will eat so many tomatoes while we're at the farm. If I put tomatoes on her plate at home, she's like, "No, I'm not eating that."
That's
So
so interesting.
yeah, so I
Well,
think
maybe they worked up. Maybe they're at the farm, but they worked up an appetite. You never know.
yeah, that too. But I
No,
think
but I suspect. Yeah, it's what you said. They have a fuller appreciation for it. Maybe is that?
yeah, exactly. And I
Oh,
think
okay.
that too, if they realize this is like more middle school, high school students, how hard
Sure.
it is to harvest certain things, they're not going to waste it because they have an idea of like how hard people are working for this food to exist, and like why food ends up costing so much, because where our volunteers harvest everything, and that allows our budget to stay very lean. People at normal farms are that's their job. So it's a lot of time and effort that's going in to harvest and plant all of this food.
That's really well said. Do you aside from like student groups and that, do you do any education? It doesn't sound like you have a ton of interaction with the maybe the end consumer of the goods, but do you ever have any kind of education you have to do with the middle people, the distributors? Maybe ways to kind of make the food more attractive to people or something like that.
We make
How
sure
does that work?
that the food pantries know what we're donating, and we provide recipes, because sometimes
Oh,
we'll be growing something that's a different color than they're used to seeing,
okay.
because produce comes in so many different varieties than you see at the grocery store. And the stuff that ends up at the grocery store ends up being maybe the seeds that guarantee the highest yields, but maybe aren't the highest nutrient density. And so we like to provide a ton of variety, a lot of different colors. Well, purple peppers, orange cauliflower, just all different kinds of things. So sometimes we'll get a message from the food pantry like, "Is it supposed to look like this?" And we're like, "Yeah, that's
And
helpful."
here's the menu to or the recipe to prove it.
Exactly.
That's
Um,
a
and then like different varieties of watermelon that are like yellow inside, orange inside. It's just not what people are used to seeing. And so I think that ties into also like the kind of imperfect food movement, that farm fresh food is not, perfectly round, shiny, especially if it's chemical free. But that doesn't mean that it can't be eaten or should be thrown out. It just means that it's actually better.
mm, counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So the recipes, it sounds like as much as there might be for like as much as they might be for kind of showing and demonstrating, to the distributor, hey, these foods are okay. Do the recipes ever make their way to the final consumer of like, this is what you can make with this, or is it strictly an educational exercise,
No,
the
they'll
the
put it
recipes?
out with their food. I think a lot of our food pantry
Ah,
partners have moved to like a farmer's market style in the summer for people selecting their produce. So they'll have recipes and different things out too, for families to utilize.
that's so smart. Yeah, it's like you're sort of on some level doing the work for them. That you give them just enough room to be creative, and then but also say, hey, this, if you need a little bit of help, that's really cool.
Yeah, a lot of
Um,
oh, sorry.
yeah, yeah, no, go ahead, go ahead.
A lot of the families that we serve are working, multiple jobs, and they don't have time necessarily to think of, how they're going to prepare certain meals. And that too is why fast food just ends up being so much more convenient, because it's ready.
Right.
And so the more that we can provide to make whole real food easier to make, and that's a big focus on our recipes too, or just like simple, you don't need a lot of stuff, but they're good. And just to make it easier to consume the produce, because they don't have the time, they're doing everything they can to keep their family afloat. um, so if we can make it easier for them, we will.
I think you even on your website you talk about this, how we'll go back to the tomato example. It can look like a tomato, and whatever, when you open it up, it's got, it looks like a tomato, and even kind of like on some level tastes like a tomato. But like again, it's like deceptive. You're not getting what you need out of the tomato. So it's almost like, what's the point of buying it? Because it does, I think this is the point you all made, is that it does kind of fill you up on some level, like as though it were a whole food, but you're actually not. It's very, in some ways, yeah, deceptive, and that you're not actually getting it. And how would you know that? Unless there's great people like yourselves out there educating. There's no other way to know that. So that was really an eye opener for me when I read about that on your website. And we'll put a link to your website in the show notes. I really want people to go there and really get a sense of all the great work you all do. But I think that's a great place to leave it, Samantha. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if anyone wants to continue this really important conversation, how can they connect with you?
Sure. My email is samantha.kuhn@jkcommunityfarm.org. And if you're interested in helping us out, we always need volunteers, and corporate volunteers especially, because they provide pretty much everything that we need for our fundraising. And so, if you have a friend that works at a different company, tell them about us. Just spread the word, because that's how we've grown over time, is just word of mouth, and we really appreciate that.
As far as volunteering goes, is there a certain
Yeah,
kind of like
our
growing season?
volunteers are on the farm early March through end of November, and
Yeah.
then kind of through the really cold months, it's quiet at the farm.
Yeah, because I know you practice that 4 season growing, but it sounds like you guys have it handled during the kind of the down season. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you so much, Chris.